sort of speak off the top of my head with thoughts that come to mind, and then we'll see where the conversation goes. So that's going to be my approach. I'm going to talk a little bit both about COVID, the pandemic, and about issues of racial equity that have been with us over the summer. And then I might say a word about the election process of a bishop that culminates in 6 days on the 29th at our assembly. And then you may have totally different things to talk about. So we'll see where it goes. It's fun to see a few familiar faces on the screen. I know a little bit about Midvale. My brother lived on the west side of Madison for 25 years, so we visited your neighborhood fairly often. I even knew the congregation back in the days of the old Southern Wisconsin district, but that was when Stan Clevey was the senior pastor and Ken Smith was the youth pastor. So it's a few years back, but and I've known your ministry from a distance from then. I know it's one of the stellar ministries in this whole part of the state. So it's fun to connect with you again. So let me here's my plan for the next few minutes. I want to make a couple comments about this strange time that we're in, this COVID pandemic time, and then a couple comments about what the implications for issues around race might be that have been so prominent this past summer since the 25th of May. So I'll just start there. I have essentially two comments to make about what's been the impact of the pandemic on the church. Some of it it's all been unpredictable because except for a few epidemiologists that study this stuff, none of us have really experienced an epidemic like this, a pandemic. So we don't know how life is disrupted. Now we do. Much of what we experience, including adult forums in church, have slammed to a halt in terms of the way we normally do things. And then we turn around and figure out how to grab hold of what has been good and find a way to make it happen in very different circumstances. And I've been very impressed by the kind of creative thought and creative leadership and good willingness to invest themselves in hard questions that's happened in most every congregation that I talk with. Somebody has gotten together and said, how best should we do this? But but as we've learned, there isn't really a clear answer. I suspect next week you will have a fascinating discussion with the members of your task force that'll report in, because good people study the circumstances, the evidence, the advice that we're given, and come to different conclusions. In this poll that I mentioned around congregations, I've taken people will occasionally ask us in the Synod, well, how many congregations are doing in-person worship, or how many are doing this? Oh, we don't know. We don't have kind of direct supervisory lines of communication and accountability with every congregation in that sense. They aren't reporting to us. But in meetings of the conference deans, and then just recently in this informal poll we took with about 50 people that were online, you sort of get a sense. And here's my sense. I think by this time, end of August, we probably have maybe somewhere, give or take, around 15 to 20% of our congregations that are doing some form of in-person worship. And almost uniformly, their experience is they have way fewer people that come to that than what they would have had pre-COVID, maybe a fourth as many or less. And they know that, but they figure that we'll just keep doing that for those people that are willing to do this. Others, the vast majority of congregations have said, no, we're not going in person yet. It carries too much risk, and there are other options. Between 80 and 90% of our congregations report regular online worship services like you do here. So, and then as I mentioned, maybe a quarter of them are doing parking lot worship, and another 15, 20, 25% maybe doing some sort of outdoor worship, which works fine in August, may not be so good in November if we're still in this. But I think most people are recognizing we do community. That's who we are. We are a faith community, so we simply find a way to do community when we can't be in person together. And that's happening. Well, one of the, let me insert in this, because it's a misnomer or a misimpression that we get a lot in congregation life. Must mean it's really easy time for pastors because they aren't supposed to show up at the office much. They aren't supposed to be with people, teach classes, lead worship. So what a cushy time. And frankly, the feedback's almost universal when I talk with pastor. It's a harder time. Not only the stress of figuring out what to do, but all of the steps in preparation and pulling it off and so on. So I've been pretty quick to encourage pastors, take care of yourself. And anytime I'm with a group of lay people in congregations, like I am right this minute, I try and make this point clearly. It's a stressful time for pastors, even when it seems like a lot less is going on. So that's one thing. I've been very impressed with the kind of the creative and the multifaceted and even quite diverse response of our congregations. I've been a bit dismayed, and this is the second point I want to make with regard to what are we observing in this pandemic. I have been a bit dismayed that in a few congregations, they tend to be more rural congregations, small congregations, pastors and some lay people report feeling sort of bullied into disregarding caution and get back to worship. Well, the other congregations in town are doing this. I think this is all a plot. And that leads me to my second comment around this pandemic time, and that is my dismay at how this has evolved so quickly into a kind of a tribal split that fits with the kind of tribal, people refer to it as tribal or cultural war divide that we have in our society on all kinds of fronts these days. And it's, I think we are reaping the results of our corroded attitude towards the importance of our common life together and the value of expertise. America has prided itself on a culture of individualism, the unfettered value of the individual and individual choice, to the point of freely pushing aside anything that calls us to compromise our individual whims for the sake of the common good. And of course, now in the days of the internet, anybody can find backing for any view they want to hold anyhow, and write off contrary advice as fake news or false science, or I can find some other scientist that backs me up. I have a daughter, our oldest daughter married a Norwegian, has lived in Norway for 25 years now. Our grandchildren are there. On March 12th, before we had even begun shutting our services down around here, that was about the time we suspended it. On March 12th, the Prime Minister of Norway got up and with all the key officials behind her announced, this is now what we need to do as a country to take care of one another, because that's what a country does. I mean, it wasn't a theological statement, but it really was, in terms of that's the value that motivates our choices now. We take care of one another. And that's not the value that has dominated our setting now. And I lament that. So people are quick to dismiss scientific expertise, quick to dismiss a governor in Wisconsin's case, or Minnesota's case for that matter, who says this is what we need to do now to keep our state safe. And if people want to disregard it in the ethic of this individualistic culture that we're in now, people are free to disregard that. And I think that's where our response to the pandemic becomes a theological issue. It becomes a faith issue, because an ethic that celebrates the unfettered right of the individual to not be infringed on by any other consideration is not a Christian ethic. It's not the ethic of Jesus or the prophets. It's not the ethic that says 2 commandments, love God and love your neighbor. It's not that ethic. So I think response to the pandemic for a Christian community needs to be, how do we care for the whole community, the whole of God's people, not just what do I want to do. End of sermon on COVID. Let's move on. Let's talk a little bit, and I'm talking too much, so I'll make this a little quicker. I want to talk about how racial justice has racial equity concerns. This synod has had a racial equity task force at work longer than most synods have, frankly, for the last 4 or 5 years. But more importantly, I think this synod took a step forward in a hopeful vote. But when 2 years ago, Vivian Thomas Breitfeld from Milwaukee was elected as bishop, some of you got to know her a bit. I understand she was a member of Midwale for a little while, and then a year ago, and after looking at the ministry that was unfolding by church-wide people and by synodical leadership and by a number of people, ultimately that her ministry came to an end. And I don't want to go into all that here, except to say this. I met in the first 2 or 3 months that I was here last October. I went around and had conversations in every one of the 12 conferences with the rostered leaders, and occasionally some folks other than rostered leaders showed up. But we talked together about what the past year's experience had been like for them and what I knew of the process that had led to her resignation. And there were a number of issues, I likened it in a way to a pastor that ultimately resigns in a congregation when trust is eroded, things have gone badly, it doesn't look like a healthy ministry can get put back together, and for everybody's sake, there's simply a separation. So we talked a bit about what some of those factors were, what people in these meetings had experienced and so on. But I always left the conversation by saying, here's a consideration I don't think we should ever lose sight of, and it's a consideration with no clear answer, because the people that were involved, both from Bishop Eaton, presiding Bishop Eaton's office, and synodical leadership, had looked very carefully at what are the issues that are impeding healthy ministry here. They were very issue focused, so that's what we talked about. But at the end, I said, those of us who are in the dominant white culture can never say for sure what role might race have played in the way we think about and process and engage any issues, whatever they may be, perhaps quite apart from issues of race. I'm part of we are a part of the dominant culture for whom this culture works well, and we think we understand all of the patterns of behavior and how it's supposed to work. And we've simply not experienced life in our setting from any other perspective. And I think, so I think it's simply a question that we need to keep foremost in our mind, how is it that we need to examine ourselves and how we interact around process all of these issues and interact with people? And how is it that we can become a church that is more welcoming to the whole of God's people? How is it that we can not be hospitable just to folks like us, but be a church for all people? Midvale is situated in a community and in a demographic that is more homogeneous than heterogeneous. It's pretty homogeneous place. And yet, it seems to me you have demonstrated, I know you are one of several congregations supportive that have been for several years now supportive of the Santa Maria ministry. We've just been in conversation with their leaders. They're in transition and just putting together, I think, about to move in a healthy and stable next chapter. And you've been a partner with them. That may not have involved very many of you personally, but it begins to set a posture for saying this is part of the value that we bring forward as a faith community. Becoming a more multicultural church is important. Final comment, just an asterisk on the whole racial justice thing. Someone sent to me an op-ed piece that was in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel the weekend of the 4th of July weekend. So 4th of July. It was written by John Gerda, who I think is the preeminent Milwaukee, even Wisconsin historian. I know John well because he's a good ELCA Lutheran. His wife's a pastor's kid, and their daughter was our daughter's best friend in middle school. So I got to know John very well. Well, he wrote an article, if you can go back into the Journal Sentinel for that weekend and find what he wrote. He identifies some parallels between Milwaukee and Minneapolis. And you would find Madison in the way he's talking. In many ways, Madison is more akin to Minneapolis than Milwaukee is. And he starts with, how is it that this eruption of awareness over racial inequity came out of Minneapolis, of all places? This very white collar and white looking professional demographic that seemed to be so progressive on so many fronts, and yet that's where the eruption arose that highlighted how disparate justice and all sorts of measurements work out in our society. And it's a hopeful article in the sense that, unlike past eruptions, the riots of the 60s or other disturbances since then, this one has not been fueled simply by African Americans. In fact, as you see city after city, these massive demonstrations that happen are primarily young and primarily white. And it's a sort of a wake-up call for saying there's a whole younger generation of Americans that are saying, are we in a society that works well for everybody? We don't think so. We think there's some examination that needs to happen. And I find that a very hopeful thing. And I have found within, I've made passing reference to these. I, back in April, started these weekly Zoom meetings for anybody who wanted to, in the Synod, to be in conversation. We've had average around 50 to 70 people week in, week out. But after the George Floyd killing, we spent several weeks where it wasn't the pandemic that was the focus of our conversation. It was, how do we best respond? Somebody here made mention in the chat time before this, talked about Sugar Creek Church down in Elkhorn. Here's an open country ELCA church in the southeast corner of the Synod. And Dick Englert, the pastor there, responded to this, to the whole focus on racial equity by simply inviting anybody in his congregation to bring a lawn chair and come on a Thursday evening, and let's just tell our stories. Let's talk about what our observations, what our experiences have been around issues of race. Let's just talk together about this. He wasn't driving an agenda. He wasn't waving a placard. He was simply inviting engagement from people into it. And I've heard of a number of those kinds of responses, and I think that's how we begin to grow. There's a lot of book clubs have turned to books to read around these kinds of issues, and that too begins the engagement and gets us going. I think that's very helpful. Last comment, and I realize I will have used up half the hour with this priming the pump. So the pump's overflowing, but here goes, final comment. I just want to make this observation about the election of a bishop in this synod. If you're a historian, which probably nobody's a church constitutional historian, but you may be aware, the ELCA back in 1988, when it set forth the process for electing a bishop, it was to be what was called an ecclesiastical ballot, which meant nothing happened until you had 400 people all in one room and they all wrote down a name to start with, and then it winnowed down. Well, over the years, people said that's really operating in the dark with nobody talking or thinking or doing anything beforehand. So more and more synods, South Central was one of them, began with, let's at least have a process that lifts up some names ahead of time, and we can have some forums or some material, learn about people ahead of time. So a number of synods are doing that, but increasingly there was still a feeling we're still pretty much operating in the dark with just little snippets or glimpses of information about people that most of us don't know at all. We should have some group empowered to go deeper. The observation was made, no congregation would ever call a pastor on the basis of as superficial information as we elect a bishop with. So why don't we have a synod call committee, which is then what we did. So we had sort of that ecclesiastical ballot to start the whole process, but that happened way back in February at conference levels, and all of those names got fed in, and there were 18 of those names who said, well, we'd be open for consideration. But the call committee's job, this is sort of taking a page out of the way the Episcopal Church does it. The call committee's job was to say, bring 4 to 6 names that you have looked into very thoroughly before the synod, and then let the synod decide among them. So most of the 400 people, actually, I think we have 380 registered to be online for our assembly next Saturday. Most of them won't know much more than they did in the former process, but they will know that a group of 9 in a call committee called 5 references for each one of these people. Each one of those 4 participated in 2 interviews with the committee. They've been online with forums that everybody could watch. So they know that the work that a call committee does in a congregation has now been done on behalf of this process. So we'll see. There's a lot of curiosity around the ELCA saying what you're doing makes a lot of sense. Maybe we need to copy that. So anyway, I'm done. That's longer than Blake's sermon was this morning, which I listened to, by the way. That was very good, including I was going to use the parallel of your children's sermon with what was the name of the rock from Capernaum that doesn't fit as well as sandstone?
Basalt.
Basalt, yeah. They're trying to figure out how to move forward with, in the midst of COVID, is sort of like trying to figure out how to build a building with basalt. But anyway. I just preached longer than Blake did. So the second half hour is yours. Where would you like to go with any of this? I think you're going to have to unmute yourself, or let's see, is there something in the chat?
Rhoda, did you have a question?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, you are.
Yep.
Okay.
Hi, Rhoda.
Hi, Peter. How are you?
Good.
Good to have you here this morning.
Thank you.
My question is about the race issue. I've just finished reading Dear Church.
Lenny
in-
Duncan?
Yes, and I assume you've read that.
Mhm.
I'm going to the chapter on,
Masculinity.
no,
Toxic, no.
no, the colors we use, the white and the dark. And I'll reference another book, Barbara Brown Taylor's Finding God in the Darkness.
Mm.
So I have become, since reading that, very aware of our use of the light and the dark imagery. And I've talked to the pastors on occasion because it gets a little much. But when I read his chapter there, I guess it didn't ever occur to me that the white that the pastors wear could be compared to a Ku Klux Klan garb. Is the church dealing with the color questions at all at any levels?
I think that's a great question. Let me add one more that horrified me even more than the alb looking like Ku Klux Klan, and that is in the last several weeks have done 3 ordinations. When it comes to the time when in usual days we have all the pastors gather around and lay hands on the person being ordained. Well, in COVID, we haven't been doing that. So I've invited pastors to gather around and hold their hand forward in blessing. So what does this look like? And somebody pointed out to me, that looks like you've got a whole bunch of people around the pastor saying Sieg Heil. You know, that never crossed my mind. So I'll figure out some other way to do that, but we won't do that quite that way again. But there's all kinds of, I mean, I grew up in the early days of TV watching Westerns. I loved cowboys and Indians, ethnic slur right there. Black hats and white hats. The good guys were always in white hats, and the villains were always wearing all black. I mean, we were just imbued with it. So when I in 1975 went to Hephatha Church in Milwaukee, a predominantly Black congregation by that time. It was over 50%, 80% by the time I left, but there up in their beautiful historic old German altarpiece was a very white Jesus welcoming everybody. It looked like a Norwegian. And so we had to deal with that. And we decided, and they had, in a few years earlier, put a picture over on the sidewall of a black Jesus. That was their way of sort of trying to deal. We just got rid of both of them and put up art, symbol art. So I think we continue to grow, but what makes light and dark hard is that that's biblical imagery, that's biblical language, that's Jesus' own language. You know, I am the light that has come into the world. I mean, there's all kinds of light and darkness and we still experience light and darkness. It's a valid, understandable parallel, but we do have to be careful about. So how is that putting light and white and all of that in a higher view than dark, black? It's one of those cases where our antenna, our sensitivity, have been enlivened in a very healthy way, I think.
Go ahead.
Our pastors, once upon a time, did wear black. And then we thought it was so much more progressive, insightful to wear white. So
Yep.
we get caught over and over and over.
Yeah. My dad, who retired in 74, was real glad that he said, I had to move through one costume change because when we were ordained, we all wore black cassocks. And then he said, then everybody said, no, we got to have a white surplice over the black cassock. He said, I made that change. I'm glad I got out of here before I had to go put all that away and buy an all white alb.
Is there another person with a question? Or you can raise your hand or unmute yourself or put something in the chat. One question in the chat talks about is the pandemic and the social issues, and I'm wondering if that's meaning a little bit the social stratification or division, moving us to remember that we cannot put God in a box. And I'm wondering how this division in our society, how the church faces that and realizes that God is bigger than any one group, maybe is part of that question.
Yeah, another soapbox I can easily get on is my concern that the whole religious landscape, actually globally, is increasingly polarized between those who are the absolutists, who have God in a box and are clear. They know what they know God, and they know how we're supposed to believe in God and act toward God and act towards others. And they get so narrow and judgmental that they turn off so many people that the other extreme arises, which is people walk away from the church, walk away from religion, say anything goes. It doesn't matter what you believe, just don't hurt anybody. And all faith, any faith is the same as any other faith. And I think we Lutherans are positioned to be in the middle because of our focus on grace. We don't have God in a box. We recognize not our relationship with God is not because we get anything right, it's because of God's grace. And that opens us to saying, I wonder what else God is up to, and makes us far more energetic, both ecumenically and even in interfaith conversations. We can, without setting aside our own convictions about the God that we have met in Jesus, we can be open to wondering how others are experiencing God and what insights they may have that might make richer our understanding of God. I think we Lutherans are positioned well to not have God in a box, but that's what an awful lot of current Christianity does, I think. I like, I'm looking at the chat room too. I like Georgia Manning's comment about learning things from 3 mixed race grandchildren who are now adults. And you've learned some things about their growing up. We have 4 kids, 2 birth kids and 2 adopted kids. Our African-American son was the only one of our 4 children who experienced being pulled over by police driving a car for no infraction. He's the only one that was followed in department stores or in stores as he walked through stores. I mean, it's just, we learn things by listening to the experience of others, and they're different from our experiences. And I think that's an awakening now that's happening.
Georgia, did you want to say something about that?
Yes. My oldest granddaughter is a teacher, and she taught on the north side of Madison, and we cannot even imagine how she was a first, second grade teacher, they looped, how some of those children live at home. She had to make a place in her classroom for one little girl to take a nap in the morning because there were so many people in her house that she couldn't get any sleep. My grandson, who's also a teacher, he's 28 now, he says he's been pulled over when he's driving somewhere between 20 and 30 times for nothing. And I never knew those things. And the middle one, she's 26. She's really angry. I've seen the anger coming out of her with what's happening because they're Black. So that's my experience, their experience.
Now both my wife and my youngest daughter have taught in, Jerry always in inner city congregation schools. And she's seen a lot of what your daughter sees as well. And I think it's important for us to remember that even those those terrible living conditions aren't universal among all African Americans. Those are results of poverty, and poverty disproportionately affects persons of color. I mean, their poverty rates are way higher, and all sorts of other attendant social dislocation or maladjustment or all sorts of things go along with that. So it's very complex, but we who have not lived in that setting engage it by first listening to those stories and understanding what those life experiences have been.
Does someone else have a question you want to ask?
Randy writes in the chat box, points out that the Synod website has brief videos and some bio on the 4 female candidates for bishop. A sidebar comment, it is true that all 4 are female. The call committee's charge was to come up with 4 to 6 candidates, and they ended up with 5. And they brought the 5 forward, but just before it was to go public, the 5th one, who was male, but who was serving a congregation that, like most of them, haven't met all this time and had been through some challenging times previously. And back in February, when he was first nominated, he said, I could be open to this. But by the time May rolled around, I can't leave. So we ended up with 4. But we have this information on all of them, including 2 hour-and-a-half long Q&A times with them. They're very instructive. Be good for you to look. So then Randy asked, what do you think are the biggest challenges for our synod and for the next bishop? I think 2 come to mind, one sort of generic across the board and one more specific. I think the generic, well, a couple of generic ones. Gee, this could get longer the longer I think about it, so I better make this quick. The 2 generic ones. Number 1, how do you build the most important factor in an effective bishop's ministry, I think, is the ability to build relationships, trust and relationships with people throughout the synod, with the rostered leaders and with key leaders in congregations. That has to happen, and that's really tough to happen in a pandemic when you can't get together with anybody. I think Zoom situations like this are good, but they work better among people who already have relationships with each other than in trying to build a relationship with someone that you don't know from before. So that's a huge challenge. I think in terms of, especially in this synod, because there's so many rural congregations, but it's not just this synod. Many congregations and many ministries in the church as a whole are asking with more urgency, how are we going to do church in coming years? Midvale is blessed to still be operating from a position of pretty good strength and vitality and energy. But I suspect your demographic skewers older, just like most churches do, although when I visited you last fall when I was first starting, and I saw a raft of kids. So you've got good things going for the future. But a lot of congregations, especially small rural congregations, are reaching the point where the model that sustained them for decades, maybe 100 years of, we can get a pastor, we have our building, we can keep things going here, isn't holding anymore. They don't have enough members, they don't have enough money, the building's falling apart, it's hard to call and sustain. So they might pair together and be 2-point, and then sometimes even that's not working. So churches are closing or facing decisions about how is it we're going to move forward in the future. How do we continue to be God's people in differing times when the largest when the largest segment of people responding to the what's your faith tradition, the fastest growing segment is none. I don't have a faith tradition. So as that becomes more and more the case, how does a bishop help? We don't, in our Lutheran polity, the bishop doesn't tell a congregation what to do, but when they're gasping for air, that's one of the places they turn to say, can you help us think about all this? So I think that's important. And the last thing I'd say that is specific to this synod, this Saturday will elect its 7th bishop, 9th if you count the interim bishops that have served, or maybe 10th. Was there one after Jan? Between Lowell and Jan? I don't remember that. Anyway, and that can't help but have a sort of a distancing effect of some sort between parish folks and the synod office. There isn't a chance for long and sustained relationships to be built. I have known every one of the 6 bishops that have gone before, and I know the history, and I know that the ending of each ministry is 6 different stories, frankly. So it's not as though there's simply a set system that is causing such rapid turnover, but there is the cumulative result of, I think, people feeling a bit less connected to the church beyond their own walls than would be true in a synod that has had a long run of bishops that get familiar and people get to know them and so on. And I think that's part of what my hope is, that this call process has maybe laid the groundwork for greater stability going forward.
Another question from the chat is, what is the Synod racial equity team working on now?
Oh, that's a good question. And I should know this because Mary Nervig has been the chair of it now. Andy Twighton, who is the pastor at Trinity over in Madison, is now chairing it. And they've put together some resources and then sought to partner with some congregations that are using these resources in order to model what are some ways congregations can pick up on sort of this moment in moving forward into pondering racial equity issues. I made mention earlier about being aware that a number of places have book study groups going. Books like White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, or How to Be an Anti-Racist, or there's a whole flock of them now that are getting a lot of attention, good attention. Lanny Duncan, that Rhoda mentioned, is another. He's an ELCA pastor who writes a loving criticism of his church, but he doesn't pull any punches in it, and it's one that'll bring good conversation.
Other questions that people have for Bishop Rogness? Feel free to jump in or write a comment.
If you aren't going to
Blake?
ask me, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, Nancy?
Well, I wanted to comment regarding the pandemic. I have finished reading The Great Influenza by John Barry, and Wilson was not for truth during the pandemic of 1918 to 1920, and people lived in fear and terror and did not get the facts. We now are living in fear and terror because we're not getting the facts now. In other words, both presidents, but in very different ways, have helped to cause fear, terror, anger, distress, And I just want to read the last 3 very short paragraphs of the Great Influenza. So the final lesson of 1918, a simple one, yet one most difficult to execute, is that those who occupy positions of authority must lessen the panic that can alienate all within a society. Society cannot function if every man for himself. By definition, civilization cannot survive that. Those in authority must retain the public's trust. The way to do that is to distort nothing, to put the best face on nothing, to try to manipulate no one. Lincoln said that first and best. And then the last line, a leader must make whatever horror exists concrete. Only then will people be able to break it apart. And I just think that's so powerful and so right on, considering where we are. And at the time that John Barry wrote this book, it was in the earlier 2000s. It was prior to this pandemic, but related to what happened in 1918 to 1920. And so I just wanted to share that. I also want to say that with respect to what you had said, Peter, a little earlier on, I have read the book, The Power Worshippers, whose main focus is Christian nationalism. And it really speaks in a very well-researched way what you were alluding to of the divisions with respect to faith traditions. So thank you very much, and thank you for being with us.
What was the name of that, the second book that you just mentioned?
The Power Worshippers by Catherine Stewart. Incredibly researched, just incredibly.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Another comment or question that someone has? Don't be shy. I see in the chat, Andrea wrote, with the way that we're doing things by technology now, is there more ability to do synod-wide projects and groups? And can we connect congregations together more in this time, because we're all meeting virtually, I would guess, so to speak. And I'm wondering if there's been talk about that, or if we can help in that way as a congregation at Midvale.
I think that's a great observation. One clear example comes to mind. Jamie Reisling, I think was her last name. Jamie was an intern at First English in Platteville this past year. So she was there as the pandemic hit. And she was going to lead a Bible study on Acts this spring. And became aware that a number of congregations around Platteville, little congregations that were either without a pastor or were in transition or something. Anyway, she ended up crafting this online Bible study on the book of Acts, and made a concerted effort to recruit people, to invite people from these neighboring congregations in about a 20-30 mile radius around Platteville. And she really had quite a response to that. Well, that's, if they had to drive 30 miles once a week on a Sunday evening or something to go to a Bible study, they probably wouldn't have done it. But here, one person in one larger congregation was offering this and had made a connection with some other surrounding congregations. Now, of course, Midvale isn't surrounded by a lot of tiny congregations, being right in the heart of Madison, but that's a good example of how geography doesn't matter anymore. I mean, I have been every bit in some ways more present with the Synod, and I'm not only in Minnesota, I'm 200 miles northwest of the Twin Cities. I'm sitting at my cabin, which you can see. and yet have been online all week with assembly planning and doing all kinds of stuff, and everybody else is sitting at home doing that stuff too. So geography isn't an issue anymore for how we connect with each other. You were talking at the beginning of this in your coffee hour time about who all was not only participating in this, but clicking in on worship. And that experience is mirrored in congregations around the Synod. Everybody's experiencing that. We had the home, my wife and I, our home congregation in St. Paul had a lovely young woman from France who had come over, was doing postdoc work for the University of Minnesota. And then she got transferred, so now she's in the Netherlands. But she really liked Christ Lutheran on Capitol Hill, so she goes to church there every Sunday morning. That's what we do nowadays and can do.
That's why I was thinking when you mentioned, there were some smaller rural congregations that were struggling, that, I mean, we don't know who they are or where they are. But if the Synod were able to somehow coordinate that it might be possible to do something like adopt a church, or, I mean, something, or just even to reach out and say, hey, join our book club, or, I mean, somehow expand what we're doing to include others that might have a much lower participation rate.
Thanks, Andrea.
Yeah, I think that's where I've, like in that Book of Acts example that I gave, or other things, it doesn't take, I think what it often takes, we are human beings, are social animals, we are relationship-based type people. If there's a personal a relationship between, say, a pastor of a large, well, and this was true again in that Acts Platteville situation, a relationship between somebody in a larger congregation and somebody in a smaller congregation, whether it's pastor to pastor or others, that come up with this kind of idea and recruit some folks from both places, then you can put it together. If a bishop were to come in and say, okay, Midvale, your assignment is to connect with Arkdale Lutheran, and you're going to do it on such and such a time. I like to joke that half the time the reaction is, "What's a bishop?" But we don't necessarily take our marching orders right away when the Synod says something. But the Synod is positioned to be the connection maker, as you say. The Synod, that's sort of the role of the Synod, is to have fingers. That's why when I said the challenge for the next bishop is relationship building. It's how do you position yourself to be able to have the kind of credibility and trust among people that they'll listen, because that's the connection point. A Synod is my grammar lesson on church language is a Synod is not a geographical entity. Look it up in a book, and a Synod is a gathering of church leaders. So when the Pope calls a Synod of bishops, a Synod of bishops, that is a gathering, that's using the term right. But I like that term for us, saying it's really simply the connectivity, the relationship between those of us who lead in the church. I like that.
That's good, those relationships. Nels asks sort of a follow-up question, since it is harder to build new relationships now. Is there any advice for doing that, either, between churches, or also, I think, we've noticed here that, it's very different trying to reach out to welcome in new members or people new to the community. We have a lot of good support from our long-term members and from maybe their friends and relatives, but we're not knowing that we're reaching new people who maybe would have visited our church had it been open.
Yeah. No, I think you're exactly right, Blake. That's, as I said earlier, Zoom works really well for people that are already connected with each other, but it's not the same as someone walking in your church and after church chatting, being greeted by the pastor or somebody else, and a conversation is struck up and pretty soon it begins to build. I mean, that's people to people kind of interaction. We're paying a price these days for not being able to do that nearly so well. And I wish I had an idea for, well, here's how we overcome that. I don't know how you do. If I knew, I'd be smart enough to probably run for bishop, but I don't know how you do it.
Well, I think we are.
I have one last comment. Thank you for being with us, Bishop Rogness. And I know that the 4 candidates for bishop in our synod are very well qualified, and we look forward to that time together this Saturday. But I would be delighted if you would run for bishop in our synod, because because your leadership has been so fantastic and has built so much trust and has really helped us a lot. So I want to take this time to say thank you to you for being with us for the past year, and express my gratitude as a pastor, and then on behalf of everybody at Midvale Community Lutheran Church, thank you for taking this call. We really appreciate your leadership.
Well, thanks, Katie, for those kind words. I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed it mostly because I've connected with people, which is my whole experience in the life of the church, connected with really fine people doing really fine work. And the two of you as pastors at Midvale and the people that surround you, I mean, it's just if I had not done this, responded yes to this call, I wouldn't have connected with the two of you and repeat that story over and over. So it's been good. It's certainly been unexpected what all we've encountered, but it's been good.
Well, we all thank you, Peter, for being with us today and for all the work you've done. And thanks everyone for your comments and questions. And we really, it's great to have so many people joining us online like this. And I think we will wrap it up now. Maybe I'll offer just a brief closing prayer as we wrap up our time together. And then we can move on with our day. But let us join in prayer. Good and gracious God, as you call us to ventures that we do not know where they will lead, remind us that you go with us, that your Spirit guides us, and that our feet are placed on the firm foundation of Jesus, our rock and our salvation. God, thank you for the leaders that we have in our synod, for Bishop Rogness, for those who are preparing for our synod assembly. Thank you for all the members of this congregation and congregations all over this synod that work every day to try and live out your love and your grace in the world and in their daily lives. Thank you for this opportunity to be together, and bless us in the day ahead. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Bishop Rogness, and we'll see you on Saturday and see the rest of you again soon.
Good. Thank you.